Hello everyone and welcome. Thank you very much to the ORF for asking me to moderate this panel today. My name is Philippa Chancellor-Wheel and I work in London for the Foreign and Commonwealth Office, and I'm their senior researcher on countering violent extremism. And in this session we'll be discussing some of the gendered aspects of CVE, a topic which has already been mentioned in a number of the preceding sessions, which I think is testament to the level of interest that this particular issue often raises. Now, women have been involved in all aspects of violent extremism. They've been involved in encouragement, in support, recruitment, strategy, and combat. So we've moved away from thinking of them simply as always as just being victims, and realized that the picture is more complex and nuanced than that. Women are equally capable of participating in political violence, and they are equally capable of adding value to some of the solutions to violent extremism. However, we're often in contexts where women are excluded from many of the spaces where the solutions for violent extremism are generated: security sector, intelligence agencies, police, and army. And we should also remember that women's involvement in CVE is not without its cautions. And I would like to discuss some of those issues with the panel today. Whenever we involve any kind of community, we really need to think about what assumptions we're basing that inclusion on, and challenge some of the thinking and rhetoric which often surrounds their particular position in society and what their capabilities are. And I'm joined on stage by some incredibly impressive women today, so you're very lucky. We have leaders in strategy, in program design, and in implementation of CVE and PVE programs. Furthest away from me, we have Archana Kapoor, who is the founder of Seeking Modern Applications for Real Transformations, which is known as SMART. And her leading work on radio stations works to empower women, educate them, and work on countering violent extremism. Next along, we have Schlaffer, who is the founder of Women Without Borders. Edith has been working on this for a very long time, founding Sisters Against Violent Extremism all the way back in 2008, so 10 years of work on this issue, so I'm sure she's got a lot of interesting insights and lessons to share with us on this topic. Next we have Mariam Safi, who is the director of the Organization for Policy Research and Development, which is known as DROPS in Afghanistan, which among other things gives a platform to women's voices in policy discourse. And closest to me, we have Nishtha Satyam, who is the Deputy Country Representative for UN Women. Now, Nishtha brings a very interesting multidisciplinary background to this panel, being an economist, and have done a number of studies on the business value of inclusion. So I think that will bring a very interesting dynamic to the debate as well. So we'll start off with the first question, and that is, what do policymakers need to consider when thinking about the role of women in CVE? I'll start off with Edith, if you want to give me a couple of minutes on this.
Thank you very much for putting together this panel. Thank you very much to ORF. I think this is so important for the first time in India. You're coming late, but not too late. We're all on a learning journey. And I would like to emphasize that women bring something to the table which I would summarize under soft power. And soft power is the hard work. It's a long-term work. And it's work that's not always acknowledged. But I think that now governments become smarter by realizing that tapping into the often conservative placement of women in their households is a key ingredient of community-based interactive work. I think what we have to do in terms of policy recommendations, we have to pay more attention to learn and listen, what to learn from those who are affected and concerned on the ground, and who are closest to those who are affected and those who are concerned. These are the women. And I will make a point that particularly mothers who accompany their children through all stages of their development, and particularly during the unruly stages of adolescent and young adult lives, they are those who are witnesses of the journeys of their children. And if they can put a stop factor into these travels in a metaphoric way, we are very well placed. So I think governments have to consider these key allies as new security stakeholders, safeguarding the communities, but also having a place, building up a new security pyramid. Usually we look at the top-down approach, but bottom-up, I think, is extremely important. We have to focus on the bottom-up. I mean, it's like shifting sands. Things are changing so quickly, and now governments are open more than ever to liaise with civil society, also UN entities, international organizations. This is an opening moment for all of us, I think on both ends, for governments as well as for civil society. And it is about trust building. Trust is the only currency we have in this interactive process. Trust is the only currency that moves us forward on the ground. If we want to achieve something, we need the mobilizers, we need those who can make a difference. And trust, I think, working on the trust on these various levels, bottom up and top down, is, I think, the way forward.
Thank you. Nishtha, do you have anything to add in terms of what policymakers should think about when including women in CVE?
Well, I'd love to give a very highly complex intellectual sounding answer to that, but it's very simple. I think policymakers need to think women when they think CVE. I know it sounds very obvious, but it's not what happens across the world. And there's enough data to say so. I think policymakers typically, and now most countries have come together and have understood the importance of regional cooperation to confront extremism in the current form that it exists. And each of the countries that we work with are involved in making what they call a counter-terrorism plan. And when you review it, it is astounding because some of them completely ignores women as change agents, as people who have common shared lived experiences in a post-conflict or conflict situation and thereby born more, women as community engagers, women in building social cohesion, and also women as agents in moving and in ensuring the tripping between negative and positive peace. And I think there's enough data and evidence in the market that policymakers should look at. But the first thing is policymakers must recognize that women are key agents in peace processes, and there is at least a 20% increase in sustaining a peace agreement if women are involved in the peace process.
Mariam, do you have any insights from Afghanistan and the inclusion of women there?
Sure, thank you. I echo what Edith just mentioned earlier, how we do have to it's not a matter of starting from the grassroots level, but finding a connection where the top-down and the bottom-up approaches to including women's voices are met somewhere. In the context of Afghanistan, before I can even make suggestions to policymakers, there is a lack of knowledge and understanding on the general overview of CVE and the push and pull factors, if you might like to say, and whatnot. There are research, but it only talks about the macro level. Micro level is missing. Macro is extremely important, but it's missing another key component of it at the very, very grassroots level. Now, when it comes to the role of women playing a role in CVE or PVE, and then what recommendations we can give, there is very, very little information and understanding about that. So in addition to urging policymakers, I would also urge the various civil society organizations out there as well to start conducting research at the household level to get a better understanding of the roles we right now have a belief that women can play, whether it is at the household level being mothers and wives, at the village and district level in informal structures of governance, tribal councils, for example. At the provincial level, there are other formal and informal structures that women do have a potential role. And then at the center, where women are in more formal structures, whether it be civil society, whether it be within the government structure, and then linking all of these. So the potential exists there. We have some understanding of what roles women can play in PVE and CVE, but it's not concrete enough to give strong recommendations. Having said that, we always have recommendations to give. And I would say countering violent extremism requires, as you all know, a multi-sector intervention. And that includes recognizing the influence and the capacity of key stakeholders and credible voices. So while this idea has received a great deal of attention in CVE circles, even in Kabul, the question of who are the key stakeholders and credible voices do not get its share of critical attention, either way, whether irrespective of the demographic that you may look at. Thank you.
I think you're absolutely right there that the research in terms of the role that women play in society and therefore the role that they can play in CVE work is going to be very varied when we look at different countries, but also when we look down at each community level as well. And we need to kind of understand some of those specific dynamics to come up with very targeted and specific interventions which can actually have an impact. And I wondered if, Archana, you could talk about the Indian context.
So I'll start with an experience I had. Yesterday, our Minister of State, Mr. M.J. Akbar, talked about the isms, and one of them was Maoism. So I've been working for years in conflict zones in India, whether it's insurgency or extremism. I worked in Kashmir, I worked in Assam, I worked in Jharkhand. So the Home Ministry, which is responsible for internal security, organized a meeting. And just a week before, I had met the Home Secretary, so he knew that I was working in Jharkhand with women on the challenges of Maoism and what role women can play there. So there was this meeting in the Home Ministry, and I was also invited to it. And there was a room full, it was being chaired by the Home Secretary, it was a room full of men. I was the only woman. There were 50 people, 49 were men, I was the only woman. And when they asked me to speak, and I said, first of all, I want to thank you that at least you thought of inviting one woman. And you know, that is the story of how governments look at inclusion of women. And I'm talking from an Indian perspective. I'm not very sure, but I'm confident that this must be the story of a lot of people who are engaged with this problem and challenges to this problem. So having said that and placing the context, I think that the first step in policy is to walk the talk. Speaking and saying that yes, women need to be empowered, women need to have their rights, we need to look at violence against women, please do something about it. So you need to not only include, but you need to engage, you need to empower, and you need to listen to women. Start listening to women. And I think that is what is very important. I wouldn't mind a policy which says, start listening to women. I think that's very important. Number two, I think that the governments need to engage with civil society. I'm really saddened that our additional secretary responsible for CT is not here. But I think that we cannot, he's gone off after the first session, but I wish somebody would reach this to him, that please engage and believe in civil society. They have far more reach and credibility in the communities because they listen to the voices from the ground and they take a bottom-up approach, as some of my colleagues have said here. The third thing which I need to highlight here is that the government needs to work with the civil society or anybody who's helping create safe spaces for women where they can speak, they can share their experiences, they can talk without fear of ridicule. One of the biggest problems in our country is that we are often told that you're a woman, you don't know anything. So where women can share their experiences, where they can talk, where they can, say things. I'll just give one more example that, we've been talking a lot about elimination of extremism. The military and the state can work towards eliminating extremists. But I think the mothers, the sisters, the daughters, the wives, the women in the family have a very important role to play in not allowing the extremists to be replaced. So the women can play a role in eliminating extremism, whereas the military and the state can play a role in eliminating extremists. So I think that that is where the difference between women-led counter-violent extremist strategies is concerned and where men-led counter-violent extremist strategies is concerned.
Great, thank you very much for that. And the first part of your response really covered the next part of the question as well, which I want to ask about is how do gender stereotypes affect the way in which CVE often plays out? And I know there have been lots of experiences in where, women have been excluded from certain spaces. And I was wondering if, Nishtha, you could talk about some of the UN's work in trying to break down some of those stereotypes.
Well, it's beyond reasonable doubt that CVE has gender dynamics, and we have to break that down to counter it effectively. Some of the work that we have done is really around the top end, which is to bring more female military officers in UN peacekeeping missions, because it is the first port of change, and we have often found that the greater number of women in uniform, there's a direct positive correlation between the number of sexual assault reporting, there's a direct correlation between children going back to school, there's greater trust, there's greater confidence, and therefore a higher possibility for lasting change and lasting peace. So some of the work that we have done in this country includes piloting a pre-deployment course called the Female Military Officers Course, which brings female officers from around 60 troop contributing countries. India happens to be the second largest troop contributing country to UN missions. And training them not just on countering extremism, but also on preventing violent extremism, which was essentially until today known as a set of development actions, but we're just readjusting that because we've seen the importance of it in the last 10 years, on how important it is to cater to trust building, to cater to needs, to ensure that their children are school, there's confidence between each other, there's a socio-economic value chain that builds on interdependencies. And we've really seen that 70% of the officers that were trained in India by UN Women were deployed in very difficult circumstances, and in every single case, we have been able to report back that there was a higher rate, there was a higher rate of change in terms of reduced crime. There was greater trust, and there's been indications of more lasting change.
Thank you very much. Mariam?
In our context, gender stereotypes within how violent extremism plays out is one that reinforces the same gender stereotypes. So in Afghanistan, young, male, illiterate, rural, Afghanistan make up the bulk of those who are sort of pushed into violent extremism. Women, victims, passive, don't know anything about PV, CVE, and religious literacy and whatnot. So what role can, and as individuals who don't play any role in violent extremism. That's sort of the two sets of perspectives. Now, when we're looking at that, I think that in the context of Afghanistan, on the very little research that we have seen that has taken place at the grassroots level, the role, there is a significant role for women in violent extremism. And the role that they play within that area is not one of a combative role. That's a little bit unusual, though there was one or maybe two examples a while ago where they were involved in actual attacks. But in terms of those supporting the ideologies of their husbands or brothers or sons within the household, those who are brought, sort of pulled into this area through family networks, community networks, household networks, those who support their sons in terms of going into violent extremism, there is research that shows that there is something there, absolutely. There are narratives that the insurgency uses explicitly for mothers of Afghan national security forces. And there's narratives through radio ringtones and whatnot that one study had pointed out where they have one narrative for the mothers of the Afghan army and Afghan police force where they say, something summary of it would be something like, sort of shame on you for pushing your son in this path and now he's died for an illegitimate cause and when you die, how will you answer to God and justify his death? And then you've got another narrative for those mothers whose sons died as part of the insurgency, which uphails them as the symbols of motherhood, and of this superiority and whatnot. And these go out to those community level, in addition perhaps to others that are there. So when we focus on these gender stereotypes and then they're continuously reinforced, and they are reinforced in the existing research, actually, that we do have in Afghanistan. It's the same gender stereotypes and it's reinforced. You really have to look through the lines to figure out if there are some other roles. I feel this gets missed. And there are universities now, madrasas in Afghanistan, that have propped up in various provinces that target young women who attend those madrasas. And it's starting to prop up bit by bit by bit. Why? Because we hadn't focused in this area till about now, and we really haven't looked at it now either.
It's very interesting understanding some of the nuances there. Edith, what's your thoughts on this?
Yeah, I would like to follow up on that. And if we want to explain to the world that women have a role to play in CVE and PVE, I think we need to ask whether women trust themselves, believe it themselves. Are they well positioned to exercise this role? So I think we need to ask the women what they actually need, what they fear, what they need, and whom they trust. Who are their allies? You know, where can they get support from? And being a social scientist, years before we developed our strategies, we turned to research. And I'm so happy that research has been quoted over and over again. We need to collect evidence from the ground. And it's not only, and I believe in contextualized evidence, but since the threat is global, we have to connect the dots. So we we got a grant, a very generous grant, to do a 3-year study looking into the potential, particularly of mothers of adolescent and young people, to step in when they fear something is going wrong. We looked at concerned and affected mothers. In countries where violent extremism was a daily affair, like Pakistan, Palestine, Israel, Nigeria, and for the history of the conflict in Europe, also Northern Ireland. It was interesting. When we looked at the when we looked at the fears, they were all the same: recruiters, radical mosque, and so on. You know, the usual narrative across the board. But when we looked at the trust scores, whom do you trust? They would say, we trust each other, but we are isolated. We don't come together. We trust the extended family. We trust teachers out of the extended family system, which is fantastic. They already trust teachers. We don't build the bridge. And there's a certain trust ambivalence with imams, with mosques, and a total trust fallout, which is a shame with law enforcement, because law enforcement is instrumental also in the protection and prevention. Not to talk about governments, international and local governments. What do they need? And I think you mentioned the needs and you mentioned listening. I think in this area which is so stigmatized and such a taboo area, we have to listen, and as a psychoanalyst I say that, you will have to listen even with a third ear to kind of look under the various layers. So they want to come together, they need a space. The women at the grassroots level often don't have the space to come together, to share their experiences. We did many interviews with mothers of suicide bombers, for example, and we have this image of the proud mother of Shahid. And when you talk to them one-on-one, they don't celebrate the death of their son. It's the saddest moment when they bring the body to the house and they expect it to fall to the ground and praise Allah and celebrate, you know, the future of the state of Palestine. So all these are misconceptions. And they need a space, they need to come together, they need to come out of the isolation. And particularly now, women are, in the European context, isolated more than ever. A woman in Bangladesh or a woman in Kashmir at least has her extended family around her. A woman in Luton, where we work now over years, coming from Kashmir, is more isolated than her family members out there. But we've created this educational model because realizing that women need space, need structure, and also need the tools. They need the confidence and the competence. And this is a huge task. This is an educational way forward. We need to look at new educational models. So we have created a kind of a school for mothers, the mother schools. At the beginning, it was challenging violent extremism, not a very smart idea. Parenting for peace. Who can say no to parenting for peace? This is a building block of our societies across the board. And this is about trust, this is about belonging, and this is about repairing the emotional deficits. And turning to violent extremism is showcasing the emotional deficits and the disorientation of the young people who miss the structure, who miss orientation. At the same time, those who are in the closest emotional and physical proximity to them, the mothers, also need the structure and also need, you know, this competence to respond, to learn about early warning signs, to learn about how to step in, particularly in the critical times of adolescence. There are models out there. We work with the Erik Erikson model of adolescent development. Mothers look at their children as they would be frozen in time, forever sweet 12-year-olds or 10-year-olds, you know. But at the age of 15, 16, 17, they need challenges and they need to respect their mothers. So the mothers need to know about the early warning signs, they need to know about the challenges, and if they're provided with these toolkits, with this knowledge, with this background, they can be change makers, natural change makers who are getting the professional tools and updating and upgrading the existing structure, like the social workers, the teachers, who go into the schools and work and interact with these concerned mothers, is also, in the best sense, capacity building. Because if we talk about sustainability, we need to build capacities because we can't be there all the time. Those are the people on the ground who do the work in their local context.
Edith, can I just ask you, there has been some criticism of this gendered assumption that mothers are in a position where they're more able to spot the signs of radicalization. And I've seen some research that said that that particular gendered assumption can actually be quite alienating to mothers because it puts an extra burden on them, and they might not actually be present in a lot of the spaces in which radicalization occurs. And so it can have the negative consequence of making them feel more shameful and guilty and actually exclude them from the CVE programs and projects like this. So do you have any ways in which we can mitigate those types of risks?
I think the shame and the blame is a true challenge. That is something every mother knows. If something goes wrong, even outside of the PVE, CVE context, everybody asks, where has the mother been? Yeah, this is the key question. But the question is justified. Where has the mother been in the absence of fathers, you know, and in the struggle of the fathers with the notions of masculinities? The mothers are the key stakeholders in protecting their children. But we can only blame them if they know how to do it, you know, but if they don't exercise this competence, if they, you know, are in collusion with, I mean, when they support their children who go into this direction, of course, they deserve the blame, you know, they are as guilty as the kids are. But though I think it's rare that mothers are not eager to protect and prevent, and it's certainly in the I would say in the psychological ecosystem of the mother's perception that she wants to do that. When we look at mothers globally, they are at the grassroots, they live in very patriarchal, conservative environments, and we can't expect that they act from the place of empowerment. But working with them through these challenges, this is kicking off a process of empowerment. So I think accepting that we go where they are through the local people with whom they live and whom they trust, and starting this process is extremely important. But this means that those who work with them accept that women not only have rights And women as mothers also have responsibilities beyond nurturing the children. They have responsibilities to stand up to these challenges we're discussing here. And whether it's traditional, whether it's kind of countering feminist notions, I don't care, I must say. And this I say as a feminist. So I think we have to be very well aware what we find on the ground. We have to kind of respect the situation on the ground, and it's hard enough for the women. And we worked with women in England, in Belgium, in Austria, where I come from, particularly with mothers from the Chechen communities. They produced a high number of fighters going to Syria. And what they have in common, this is so amazing, and they are the most traditional women. They have an emotional bond which they actually utilized. They were the connection to the women in the caliphate. When they left, the women were at the beginning very angry, they were anxious, they were furious, but at the same time, they kept the connection going. You know, they were in touch with them. And they worked with, and we have so many insights about the process of radicalization and the process of the seducement and with whom they went and why they went and what was the lure and what was the promise. Because these women talking with the kids who left on Skype, on WhatsApp, keeping the conversation going, which was very hard, they never gave up on these kids. The fathers actually became quite upset and were not willing to lead these conversations in the same patient way. But nevertheless, when we look at the whole of society approach and mainstreaming the whole space, and particularly that level of interactions, we need to look at the men as well, because they love the children in the same way, but they feel I think, a stronger sense of failure. They failed as the protectors, as the head of the household. So they try to kind of delete this whole thing and very often distance themselves from the children. So I think not worrying too much about whether this is a progressive or a regressive attitude, we just have to do it. We have to do it, and we have to try to bring mothers into this space as stakeholders, to take them seriously. And whenever I go now to international conferences and so on, we try to bring testimonials, because they are the alternative narratives we need. Not mothers who sit live on stage. This is, to a certain extent, a sensationalizing and an exploitative process, but the alternative narratives coming from the home front, where the action actually took place and where we have to continue to work on the reconciliation side.
Archana, what are your views in terms of the role of mothers compared to the role of fathers and some of your experiences with your radio station?
There's so much information on this stage that, going back to the question is very important. Where gender stereotyping is concerned, if I go back to the basic question, it's evident in all sectors. In India, internationally, we just have 6% women in media. We have just 8 to 11% in the parliament. We have just 4% in the UN. So when we talk about CVE, why do we look at it as gender stereotyping, impacting, or, preventing CVE? So I think that's very important. And when we talk about gender, I think it's the men who need to be mainstreamed, and they need to start thinking about the role that women can play alongside them in countering violent extremism. No intention to hurt anybody's feelings, but just look at our panel. We are talking about role of women, and we don't have a single man who can talk about the role of women in countering violent extremism from a woman's perspective. So the task is left upon women to place themselves in a position where they can influence decision making. So the entire burden of having a role in anything is on the women, which itself, I think, speaks volumes about how we look at roles of women in various fields. Number two is that some of my colleagues have already said it, but I'd just like to reiterate, from Zarnev to Qasab. Qasab is the only live terrorist who was caught in the Mumbai terror attack which changed the way we look at terrorism, which changed our entire, the Indian way of looking at extremism, and accepted that, yes, we are also equally vulnerable. They all reach out to their mom. Somehow, somewhere, inadvertently, they want to reach out to their mom. The image of Zarnev's mother leaning on him when he was breathing his last has stayed with us. So we must not forget that even if we are 5% or 4% who have got an opportunity to make a difference, we have the ability to make a long-lasting difference in the lives of our children, not as always victims, but as leaders who can give them the values of tolerance, cohesiveness, living with each other, and believing in what is right. Of course, I run a community radio station in a very Muslim-predominant area, about 70 kilometers from here, but I'll talk about it later. But I did 30 podcasts, 15 from India and 15 from Pakistan, talking about the role of women in peace. And these are available on a platform called Mothers on Air, which I started. And that's another, it's another story, but I keep asking Facebook that why don't I get those many hits as what other people get? So definitely the whole way that social media works is very different from what you and I understand. There are a lot of other inbuilt factors which promote certain sites and which don't promote certain sites. Because I've been on this platform for almost now 2 years and talking about these stories, but we get very few hits. But what I'm trying to say is that every woman believes that she has a role to play in peace. Because we talked to about 100 women in India before, and especially from the conflict zones of Kashmir, where we spoke to them and they said that they want peace and they want to be ambassadors of peace. But the fact is that they don't get an opportunity because they are women, and my colleagues have already talked about it. But the same story was about our neighboring country also. And women have not only used the emotional quotient, you know, of tears, of appeal, of other things, but they have gone to every extent to prevent their youth, to prevent the boys from picking up the gun or becoming extremists. So my concluding remarks to this question is that we need to start thinking, men need to start thinking, men need to start involving, and women have as much capability and as much stake in peace as the men. So I think the gender stereotyping needs to break at every level. We need to break these walls, and we need to sit across the table and work as a team. We need a balance, and we need to look at women as victims as well as women as perpetrators, women as submissive people who are lured to, who are attracted by this toxic ideology, as well as look at the leaders who have resisted. So we need to build more role models as we go along, people who can be imbibed, who can be followed, who can be understood better, and who have an equal stake in this peace process. Thank you.
Nishtha, your comments on this?
Well, no, it's never surprising that the world comes back and puts the onus on women who happen to be the most disenfranchised and disempowered in that situation. And I think that's kind of a counter-feminist approach, and I think we all deal with it. But we've seen examples too, particularly within UN peacekeeping missions, where mothers and sisters have played a very, very important role. And that role can be traced back into the basic drivers of radicalization and how radicalization processes occur in the first place, which largely looks at unresolved conflict, a shared sense of loss between women. And therefore, they're more worried about not going through that loss all over again, the immediacy of having to bear the household burden, or the economic burden of the household, and therefore to look at resurrection, getting back and mainstreaming into the society, than to look at going back to the state that it was. So we've seen women, not just in their roles as mothers and sisters and otherwise, but women as community leaders, playing a very, very effective role in social cohesion, in building interdependencies, in coming together because they have a shared lived experience and a shared experience of the same kind of loss, the same kind of concerns. Of course, when you look at radicalization processes, particularly that look at collective grievances and victimization, particularly at instances where communal identities are threatened, or communal and ethnic identities are threatened, it's often women that you will see who are quick to adopt measures that reinforce their communal identities to ensure that there's a place in society. So therefore, there are certain characteristics to how women behave and how women consume that do make them very effective negotiators and agents in the peace process, whether as mothers, whether as sisters, or people within households or communities. But across these levels, I think women have been very, very effective in ensuring that a peace agreement is reached, and if it's reached, is lasting.
Okay, thank you for your contributions to that question. I think it's very interesting that one of the issues raised was that we need more women's representation, but at the same time, we also need the engagement of men in this field and champions of male voices for women as well. It's quite a careful and dynamic balance to reach there, and difficult in each different country context, I think. The final question that I want to ask is around the evidence base for all this. So some people will say this is all rhetoric, that we need to include women. So what's the evidence that women are actually really effective in this sector and do have an important role to play?
Do you want me to start? Well, we have a real-life evidence from this country. In 2007, January, for the first time, an all-woman Indian UN peacekeeping mission, a police unit was deployed to Liberia, and there were successive deployments in 2008 and 2009. And in the pre-deployment training, women were trained to expand their terms of reference or their role beyond just policekeeping to ensuring that there was first aid, to ensuring that children were going to school, to ensuring education on HIV/AIDS, ensuring community outreach, job skills training, education on sexual violence. And eventually there was an evaluation that was done, and the results that we had from that evaluation were actually startling. Because it did prove that there was an immediate reduction in lowered crime rates, armed robbery, and the most significant change that we saw is that more Liberian women, more local women joined the police force, which eventually led to the reform of the police force in Liberia. So that's not an example from too far in the day, it's 2008. And we've been able to replicate that success in 2009 with successive deployments, not just in Liberia, but other countries, where there's a direct correlation, absolutely a direct and a positive correlation, with more women in the peace process and more lasting change, and not just change in terms of extremism, but the ecosystem of things that would allow a country to pass from negative to positive peace.
In the Afghanistan context?
Today, earlier, Mr. Aryan Sharifi, my colleague from Afghanistan, did away with a few myths. I think I'm going to do a few more to his list. Very recently, in Afghanistan, a organic grassroots level peace movement started. And it started in Helmand province, one of the most restive provinces in the country. In these tents, men and women were sitting, and these women are not civil society. These are women in the household. These are not prominent women. These are regular, everyday women who decided to sit in those tents in Lashkargah city, and demand from both the Afghan government and the Taliban to call a ceasefire and to bring peace to this restive province. And when I saw that, I thought to myself, they say that those, patriarchal attitudes, structures in the country prevent women from playing a key role in these particular areas. But then in Lashkargah, of all the places in Afghanistan, these women are sitting in peace tents. And they went to the Taliban. They told the Taliban that we are here as your sisters, as your mothers, asking you and seeking peace from you. To which the Taliban responded to them, we have these conditions, we acknowledge your request, please take our request to the Afghan government, which was done, and then for whatever reason, there was no response from that side. But these individuals are now marching to Kabul. It made me realize that there is no such thing that these patriarchal, these sort of dominant, frameworks, and I don't want to say across the country, but in this context, and this can be stretched in many various areas, don't limit women. And second thing that you always hear, these narratives that you always hear, security, Security demobilizes women. Security prevents mobility, prevents women from playing a role in here, 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 here. Whether it be women at the national level, the High Peace Council, who are supposed to sit and negotiate with the insurgency, to those women at the community level. But in the most restive province, they're sitting there. Is there no threat of security there for them? Of course there are. These are two myths, and they're myths because they're not cross-sectional. The contexts differ in various areas. Now, having said that, women's role in CVE, on what we can see at the present moment, the traditional roles, the traditional placement within the household, as you had also mentioned, Edith, this actually is a first step if we want to look at CVE in the context of Afghanistan. Because, as we were talking earlier, you don't want to remove these women within their environment to be able to tell them what CVE is and this is what you should do and these are early warning signs and et cetera, et cetera. No, you can do this within the household structure because women, as the caregivers, they are the main actors in providing what we say tarbiyah and akhlaq, manners and ethics to their children. So this can be used and it can be used in various ways. Both mothers and as wives. Studies have shown that in some cases, wives are able to influence decisions outside of their household through their direct interactions with their husbands within the household. So that's one way of getting those views out. This was revealed by a female focus group who said that inside the family, women have direct roles, while outside of the family, they spread their views through their men. Now, as mothers, the agency of mothers is something we have touched, and I just mentioned as well in terms of the manners and ethics. Civil society organizations in Kabul have highlighted, while these dominant, patriarchal structures in most households and communities do have a limiting role in women's agency in some communities, where it may appear that women are not empowered, they actually wield emotive influence within families and communities, and their voices may be especially compelling in those structures. Then you've got women within the communities. See, in Afghanistan, at the village level, at the district level, at the provincial level, you have what it's called, at the village level, community development councils. At the district level, you have development district councils. These were the old Jirga structures, Council of Wise Men, that have now become formalized and brought under the structure of the Afghan government. These are local, informal dispute resolution structures. So every village has to have a female structure like this. At the district level, men and women are mixed. At the provincial, you have the provincial council that has men and women. Within these structures, women play a key role in helping to resolve family-related disputes. That is the conflict mediation tool they use. So you have this platform where women have played a significant role in resolving family disputes that can lead and is a factor of pushing a lot of individuals towards extremism in Afghanistan. In Afghanistan, one of the biggest things we've seen in the past is a lot of people that were picked up by international forces early on for reports that they received that they were members of the insurgency, but it was actually tribal disputes. It was family disputes. And those people were thrown in prisons where they were not radicalized, but when they came out, they were radicalized, right? So they have helped in those. Those examples are there that we have to look at. And I would say that, at the civil society role, women-led civil society organizations or civil society generally in Afghanistan has an indirect role in supporting CVE in the country. Whether it's through their capacity building programs, their training programs, the bit of research that has already been done, all of these engagements actually work in, also they've done a lot of trainings for women at those community level dispute resolution forums. These training programs, these capacity building programs, awareness, literacy, religious literacy, all of these programming has had an indirect role in supporting women's participation in CVE. And in Afghanistan, when you go at the grassroots level, a lot of the programs are not called CVE. It's a bit of a sensitive issue. So you do all of these various other programs that then lead to support that area. So just to end here, there are various of those platforms that women can be supported. We can look into it to identify specifically what role, but let's acknowledge and step away from one thing. A lot of the things, the biggest thing that bugs me in Afghanistan is when we're talking about women and women's narratives, we tend to couple it to support that one mainstream narrative. You know, we have to understand that while you have women that are supporting this process, you have women that go against this process as well. And so we need to bring that in. But it's going to be a challenge to do it in CVE because within the Afghan peace process, I'm not seeing it being done. So it will take some time.
Okay. Edith, do you have any examples, perhaps from the European context, of the evidence that women can play an impactful role in this space? And if I could ask you to be quite brief so we could leave some space for questions at the end, that'd be great.
Yeah. I think that when we started working in this space of CVE, PVE, it was a distant threat. Of course, there was 9/11, there was 7/7, but at the same time, you know, it was somewhere in the Swat Valley, there were bombings in Afghanistan, it's still going on, but we did not feel we are directly in our daily lives irritated, affected. Now it's different. I think the threat is in our middle. It is almost in our DNA now. It has changed the way we look at each other, the way how we live with each other. It has led to otherizing, and I think the biggest threat and the biggest success of the extremists is that they achieved something which could culminate in an still escalating polarization in our societies, and this is across Europe. I think this is the biggest threat. So what to do? I think women have to be resilient. How to do it? They have to find opportunities. We believe in education. We have created the mother schools model. We have now over 2,000 alumni across Europe and beyond, and a huge pool of capacity of teachers, of community mobilizers who continue this work in their communities. But we need evidence that it works, of course. The evaluation and measurement process is crucial. And we have to do it in a smart way. If you just kind of distribute questionnaires, the women are smart. They ask me, my team, you know, and the local teams, what should we tick to be able to continue? You know, they know what it is about at the end of the day. So what we try and need to measure overall is the change over time and the change in the process. We have to believe in the process. And the evaluation of the process is very important. How I would measure the success of the mother schools we are rolling out now in 12 countries, from England to Austria, Germany, Belgium, and the Balkans, which is absolutely important now in the European context. I would say, how do women position themselves and present themselves at the end of the program? And we have a community outreach program. It's a graduation ceremony where they, and usually we place it in a town hall, or women even create their own peace marches and whatever. But women who did not even know that they had a voice fight over, you know, having the floor and talking about their experiences and talking openly to the community leaders, claiming and reclaiming this space of community leadership. I think this is incredibly important. And I would say, to sum it up, the big challenge for us is, at the civil society level, that we have to help the women get the confidence to reclaim the recruiters' tools, because they do nothing else, you know, than what the women should do. The women, the mothers, have the emotional bond. They are in the closest proximity, but they let it go. The recruiters have to fight for it, and then they use it. They tap into this void. And I think reclaiming these tools, this is the big challenge, and this is the strength, particularly of the mothers who know their children and the youngsters, and they know their journeys and their anxieties better than everyone else, and to kind of bring it to the next level and bring this into the alternative narratives, which I would like to say are very male-driven. When we look at the testimonials of the formers, I can't remember a single testimonial of a female former. They are all guys who turned around. They have been fighting in Afghanistan. They came back. And in reality, the women are best placed to be alternative narratives, but we have to look out for them.
That's a very interesting point, yeah.
And
It is always the male narratives exactly. in the formers. Archana, do you have any evidence of the direct impact in maybe just 1 minute?
I'll try to be as brief as possible, but I always get the mic the last, so... you know, we've all understood this, that the problem is global, but the solutions have to be local. And I think that is the key where we talk about community radio stations. And we've just started. It's a problem. Even CVE, we look at it, or even violent extremism is not such an old problem, although we heard that it's been there forever. Yesterday we heard that. But the fact of the matter is the way it has got manifested is very recent, and we've just started working. So I don't know if I have hardcore evidence, but yes, I think that the most important thing is reaching out, because we've not been able to place why it occurs and how it occurs. Whether it is deprivation or it is, you know, marginalization, isolation, lack of education, all this has been debunked, because now we see that the youth of opportunity are being attracted to the toxic ideologies rather than the youth of deprivation. So there are a lot of ifs and buts and question marks, but having said that, I think the most important thing is to create spaces for women to share their experiences, to share their concerns, to talk about their children, to create these safe spaces has become very important. And this has to be done in the communities where they come from their comfort zones, in dialects that they understand, in languages that they relate with, from people who they know. So that is where the start of a bottoms approach starts, you know, begins. So that's why I believe in it. I'm confident about it. Whether we look at Africa, or we look at the UK, or we look at Australia, or we look at India, or we look at Bangladesh, we have this very powerful local tool called community radios, which address different communities across different geographies. These are so local that you can reach out to only about a 10-kilometer range. And I think that we have understood, and everybody accepts, that the social media, of course, is creating all kinds of narratives, but it has also contributed in a way in linking people of certain ideologies and giving some kind of boost to the growth of extremism. So it's time to go back to traditional tools. It's time to go back to face-to-face interactions. It's time to go back to small, and it's time to listen, to allow people to speak, and provide them these safe spaces where they are comfortable. Also, coming on radio enhances the image of women, because when we read a name in the newspaper, we think they've arrived. When we hear a voice on radio, we think that they have arrived. And they have something to say, that is why they have been invited. So in its own way, it plays a very vital role in strengthening, empowering, and enhancing the capacities of women. It plays a very important role in reaching out a message in a language which people accept and acknowledge. And I think that the challenge here about inclusion of women is, in a certainly different way from what Mariam said, is providing secure, safe spaces and not increasing the vulnerability of women. So I think that, and radio gives you that anonymity. And it's not like television where you can only create that mosaic on the face. It's a voice. You can change a name. The story can remain the same. It can be my story being told by Edith, or Edith's story being told by somebody else. So that is, I think, something which all governments need to look at when we talk about including women. Because still they are vulnerable, still they are, you know, very few who are willing to come out and speak. So we need to create these kind of platforms, and that's what I've been doing for several years now, 7 years.
Okay, thank you very much. And I'm very conscious that we are standing in front of your lunch, and we only have 10 minutes for questions. So I'm just going to take 2 questions from the audience. So whoever can sprint up to those microphones first wins. So just step on up. Yeah, go ahead.
Hi, I'm Sonakshi from the Observer Research Foundation. Firstly, I'm going to address the question about there not being any men on the panel. It's primarily because when we look at the women, peace, and security agenda, we're now looking at women in peace and security. And as Ms. Satyam said, women are disenfranchised, disempowered. We want to hear from 5 empowered women about CVE discourse. Okay, second point, it's actually a question to Dr. Schlaffer. You're a social scientist. I work on GBV and CVE at ORF and drawing the links between these things. So I was wondering whether, and one of the theories I look at is structural violence, as Galtung envisioned it. And I was just wondering whether we could talk a little bit more about what you said and whether women have those sort of spaces, even within familial setups, to make their points heard, and whether the development agenda can then work in tandem with your women, peace, and security one.
Okay, do we have a second question before we take that one? Come on.
I think we're exhausted the audience, huh?
Good afternoon. I'm Minaya from IPAC. My question to Ms. Archana Kapoor, it is keeping in view the Indian perspective. Ma'am, actually, in the Northeast and in the Kerala, there is the matriarchal society. The education level is quite high. But what's the reason of the growing extremism there? And how we can tackle that? Thank you.
It's a very interesting question. In the interest of gender equality, I'm going to let one man ask the question as well, because we raised the issue of it being very important that we hear their voices as well.
Actually, I was also hoping on that you'll include me. To be very honest, to start with, as a security force personnel, when I was looking at the sessions that I should attend in the seminar, I have to admit and confess that I almost skipped this part. But I'm so glad that I actually did and stayed on for this session. It's an eye-opener for me personally, and maybe for a lot of security officers here as well. I have a question based on the 2 examples that were given by Ms. Mariam and Ms. Nishtha. Ms. Nishtha, you talked about this women's battalion in Libya. I'm not sure, was it an Indian women's battalion? Sorry? Liberia. Was it an Indian women contingent?
All Indian.
All Indian. Okay. And the second example was about the women in Helmand district taking on the Taliban and the government. My question is to Ms. Archana as well as to Ms. Nishtha. Do you think that these 2 examples can be replicated in J&K, for example, or in the Northeast also in India? Because as a security force personnel, I have unfortunately faced women in these situations only as sort of a shield, protecting people whom we thought needed to be corrected or whatever. And also, we have hardly had any kind of women's role in the forces in J&K. Also, primarily because so far the women have not been have not come into the combat roles in the Indian security forces. So, do you think that these 2 examples can be replicated effectively? And what would be the response of the society to these examples?
Thank you very much for that question. If we could take that the last question first.
Yeah, sure. I'm just going to quickly respond to you, sir. So the first example that I gave of Liberia has been successfully replicated in consequent years, and now we have all-women battalions in Congo and so many other countries where we exactly have the same experience. As far as coming back and looking inwards, we have started work with CRPF, which is the largest paramilitary. We do have an all-women's battalion in Jammu right now. We do work very, very closely with BSF. It is a model that's working that the Indian government is very proud of. We are very proud of. The Center for UN Peacekeeping is very proud of. So it is an example that has worked for us irrespective of geography because of what brings it together. But then I was itching to make a point at the end of the last panel, and to the woman who, to the lady who was commenting on the architecture of the session itself. I'd love to hear a session where men are questioned for their effectiveness in negotiating peace. I'm not too sure why suddenly there's a conversation on evidence when it comes to women. We are 50% of the population, the first and the worst to be affected in a state of conflict. There is absolutely no evidence and justification that needs to be put on the table on why we need to be a part of the peace process. It is bad enough that we are sitting here and trying to give examples, because that's what women have historically done, which has proved value and worth to be included, despite being 50% of the population. That's all that I wanted to say. But having said that, is there evidence? Yes. Is there cross-sectoral evidence? Yes. Is there cross-country experiences? Yes. Is there cross-force evidence, which means does the BSF, does CRPF, does UN peacekeeping missions, are examples of all-women battalions comparable in countering extremism? Yes.
Thank you very much. Great response. Can I just go to Archana on the issue of...
I just want to respond to the gentleman from the security forces. I've just done the 4 years book for Home Ministry, and 33% reservation is in the CAPFs for women. So in the Bastaria battalion also, which has just come up in the LWE areas, there are 742 men and 258 women in that battalion. So increasingly, I think that as Nishtha said first, that the women in uniform, the numbers are increasing, and they are not only used as shields to prevent riots, but they are hardcore, they are in there, and they are working. And I think Jammu and Kashmir has really opened up to including women in that. That was one.
Can I just hear your comments as well on the matriarchal society?
Yeah. I actually, it's going to take one full session to start talking about the reasons and of terrorism and extremism, and again we go on to marginalization, neglect of the Northeast for so many years. If you look at if you look at Assam, then what the government is claiming that the Northeast at least does not have any kind of extremism now, and it's absolutely clean. That's the government's claim, but they are talking about LW in the other 35 districts of the country, where there are 126 districts that were impacted and which have come down to 90 districts now, where LW is concerned. But coming back to it, again, I'll just stick to my point, how many platforms have we created for women to share their experiences, even if they are matriarchal societies? We have only 2 community radio stations in the 7 districts of the Northeast, and that too 2 in Assam, in the universities. My humble submission is create platforms where women can come out and speak. They don't get opportunities to speak. They don't get opportunities to share. And matriarchal societies are now just left as, these are just semantics that we are playing around with, because there's as much rape and violence against women in Kerala as it is in the Northeast. So, we need to look at creating opportunities for women to come out, speak out, and share, and get that space in society which they deserve, not today, but for years. Thank you.
30 seconds. First of all, matriarchal communities are groomed in patriarchy. Okay? So, where the maternal uncle is the more important person. So, it is structurally different, but it's not fundamentally or radically different from the societies that we've seen. 2, when we talk about extremism, where there is a great link to patriarchy itself, but there are other links to abject poverty, to the remoteness, and none of that has to do with particularly literacy. Well, some of it has to do with literacy, but not all of it has to do with literacy. I think what we're talking about is in a state of conflict where communal ethnic identity is threatened, and you combine it with literacy and access, I don't want to go to social media, but I'm still going to say it, with access to information, how does radicalization occur? It's not just a function of patriarchy or matriarchy, it is a function of so much more. So I think it would be oversimplistic to say, if a society is matriarchal, then how come there is a rise in extremism? I think that's a very simplistic understanding of how radicalization occurs.
Okay, and you have any very brief comments?
Yeah,
about the spaces, creating spaces?
Pardon?
There was a question directed to you about creating spaces and whether there are enough spaces for women.
Yeah, structural violence. I mean, structural violence is a female reality across the cultures. That goes without saying. And I will give you an example. I understood how structural violence against women at the forefront can be a driver. I had conversations with the mother of the so-called 20th hijacker of 9/11, Aisha al-Wafi. Her son was trained in a pilot school in New York, and he fortunately was pulled out because his papers were not quite right and he refused to learn how to land. So this mother reached out to the mothers of the victims, and she said how sorry she felt for what has happened around 9/11, and that she, as a mother of terrorists, you know, she is anyway otherized and isolated, but she feels with the mothers of the victims, and one of these mothers responded to her, and they started an unlikely dialogue, which we hosted in Vienna, and we brought this unlikely dialogue, and dialogue totally out of the norm to the stage, and even our prime minister was there to host it. So this is, I think, a good example how we can connect with policymakers to come to the very beginning. But what I learned from the conversations with Aisha, why did her son go and join the fighters in Afghanistan? He shared it with her in hindsight. He said, I could not stand the ongoing violence at home. He witnessed how his father tried to push the mother out of the 11th floor of the high-rise building where they lived in France, and she could save herself, and that was the culmination of a whole chain of violence. And he said he had to kind of save himself and find a more peaceful space. Imagine a more peaceful space in the mountains of Afghanistan. So I think that what these kids encounter very often in their immediate environment, you know, is certainly an unrecognized factor to drive them into this direction. So the normalization of violence in many communities is certainly an underestimated factor. We have to look into this, and this is the whole of society approach. When we tackle violent extremism, we can't drum up the people and say we're going to do programs on violent extremism. We have to look at the issues within the communities. We have to
I'm going to stop you there because I think that's a great place to stop.
I think this is,
it has to be a whole of society approach.
It is a whole of society approach, to sum it up.
Definitely.
Exactly.
We have to have an inclusive approach across the whole of society to address this specific issue. Women play a really important role in that, and I thank you all for your very interesting contributions, and I'm glad at least one person in the audience has changed their views because of this. So please join me in thanking the panel.